All right, ready to dive deep.
Mm.
Today we're tackling one of those really powerful moments in the Bible, Jesus praying in Gethsemane.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
It really is. And what it reveals about his sacrifice. We're looking at a sermon that digs into Matthew 26 and 27.
Okay.
And it unpacks this whole thing about the cup that Jesus prayed to avoid.
Hmm.
And, you might think you know the story, but I guarantee there's something here you haven't thought about before.
I'm intrigued. What's got you so hooked?
It's how this passage kind of flips the script on our ideas about strength, especially when it comes to faith.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
We see it right off the bat with Peter.
Right. Even if everyone else deserts you, I never will.
Classic.
Peter.
So sure of himself,
Yeah.
always. But the sermon makes this point that kind of self-assuredness, it actually made him unfit to lead, at least in the way Jesus intended.
Interesting. So it's not just about blind faith and loyalty.
Exactly. The sermon says true Christian leadership is not about being cocky in your own ability. It's about this deep lack of self-reliance, but paired with total confidence in God.
That's a powerful distinction. So are you saying even Peter, with all his devotion, needed a dose of humility?
It makes you think, right? If Peter needed that humbling, how often are we letting our overconfidence get in the way?
You're hitting close to home with that one. It's so easy to think we've got it all figured out.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
And then, bam, reality hits. But here's what's really fascinating. In this same passage, we see Jesus, the Son of God, seeking support from his disciples.
Wait, really? I don't recall that.
The sermon really zooms in on that moment, when Jesus asks them to pray with him in the garden.
Wow. I never really focused on that before.
Picture it. The Son of God asking for human support. It's almost shocking.
It really is. It makes you reevaluate how you see, the whole idea of spiritual strength. It definitely challenges that image of the lone wolf, even Jesus needed community.
It speaks volumes about his humility, and it kind of makes you wonder, right? Do we ever feel too spiritual to admit we need help?
That's a tough question. One we probably don't ask ourselves often enough.
Seriously. Food for thought. But this whole idea of needing support, it actually connects directly to that instruction Jesus gives. Keep watch with him.
Oh, right.
But the sermon's not just talking about staying awake physically.
Oh, so it's deeper than that.
Way deeper. It's about being spiritually alert. It's about knowing we constantly need God's help.
Especially when temptation comes knocking.
We've all caved because we weren't paying attention, right?
Yeah.
Our spiritual guard was down.
Yep, been there. And that's what makes this whole passage so fascinating. It's like this constant spiritual battle we're in, whether we realize it or not.
And that brings us to the central mystery, the big question, the agony of the cup.
Okay, so what was this cup Jesus was so desperate to avoid?
The sermon blows right past the usual interpretations, like just being afraid of death or being tired.
Right, that always seemed a bit simplistic to me.
So if it wasn't just the pain of the cross itself...
What was it? What did Jesus value even more than his own life?
I'm glad you asked. Buckle up, because this is where things get really interesting.
The sermon goes out on a limb here. It says that what Jesus valued most, more than anything, wasn't just life itself, but his connection with God the Father. That perfect unity they had, from the very beginning.
Hold on. So you're saying the cup wasn't just about physical suffering. There was something even deeper going on, something even more terrifying.
That's exactly it. The sermon argues that the cup was the horror of being completely cut off from the Father, like taking on all of humanity's sin and everything that comes with it.
Wow, that changes how you see Gethsemane, right? It wasn't just about pain. It was about the potential loss of that divine connection. Heavy stuff.
And theologically, this is huge. The sermon points out that the real punishment for sin, what makes hell hell, isn't just dying, it's being eternally separated from God. And that's what Jesus was facing, what he experienced for those 3 hours on the cross.
Almost too much to think about, isn't it? Like Jesus wasn't just dying on the cross. He was experiencing the worst possible spiritual state, all because of us.
It's a concept that's almost impossible to grasp, but the sermon really wants us to understand the sheer scale of what Jesus endured, that he chose to take on that separation, that spiritual agony, all out of love.
And the sermon keeps bringing it back to us, It challenges us to really picture Jesus in that garden, begging the Father for another way, but still choosing the cross for us.
It's like we're being invited into that desperation, that same love that drove Jesus. This wasn't just some abstract idea. It was a deeply personal sacrifice.
It's easy to get caught up in the historical details of the crucifixion, But this sermon makes it real. You feel it in your gut.
Absolutely. And it transforms how we understand Jesus' sacrifice. It wasn't just about dying, it was about enduring the worst possible spiritual anguish imaginable. And he did it willingly, for us.
So where does that leave us? If Jesus valued this connection with God more than anything, even his own life, how should we live? What should matter most to us?
Now you're asking the big questions. The sermon doesn't give us a roadmap or anything, but it definitely makes us examine our own lives, doesn't it?
Like, are we putting our relationship with God first, above everything else? Are we willing to face hardship, to make sacrifices, to keep that connection strong?
Those are questions we all have to wrestle with. But what's clear from this passage is that the depth of Jesus' love, the immensity of his sacrifice, it goes way beyond what we usually imagine.
It's wild to think it all started with a simple request. Jesus asking his friends to stay awake and pray with him.
Such a small thing.
But when you grasp the context, it takes on this whole other meaning. Makes you think about what it really means to follow Jesus, right? It's not just about the outward stuff.
It's about going deeper, cultivating that same kind of intimacy with God that Jesus clearly had.
And the sermon makes this point about needing each other, too. Being honest about our weaknesses.
Yeah.
Just like Jesus was in the garden.
He didn't just ask them to pray for him, remember. He specifically asked them to pray that they wouldn't give in to temptation.
Like he knew they were going to mess up.
Exactly. He wasn't expecting them to be perfect. And that's so encouraging, isn't it? The Son of God facing the worst possible situation, and he still leans on his friends, flaws and all.
It really challenges that whole lone wolf spirituality thing, doesn't it? Like, we need community. We need support.
And speaking of needing support, the sermon doesn't shy away from Peter's, his big failure.
Oh, yeah. Mr. I'll never abandon you ends up denying Jesus 3 times. Talk about irony.
It's almost hard to believe, right? But the sermon makes this point that the whole experience, as awful as it was, it actually broke Peter's pride. And that, in a way, prepared him for leadership later on.
Sometimes you have to hit rock bottom to finally learn to depend on God, right?
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even our biggest mistakes, our darkest moments, can be redeemed. But going back to that image of Jesus in the garden, praying so intensely, there's this one detail the sermon mentions that I can't get out of my head. It says that when Jesus was abandoned by the Father on the cross, the earth literally shook. Like, there was an earthquake.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, it's easy to miss. But the sermon highlights that earthquake, that disruption of nature. It shows just how powerful the connection between Jesus and the Father was before the separation. Like, if being torn apart caused a cosmic event, imagine how strong their unity was before that.
Wow. It's like we're getting this brief glimpse into the heart of God. The depth of his love for Jesus and the sheer pain of that temporary break.
It's a powerful reminder that the spiritual realm is real. It's not some vague ethereal thing. There's real power there.
This whole conversation has been pretty mind-blowing. It's given me a whole new perspective on, everything leading up to the crucifixion. It's more than just a story. It's this incredibly intimate picture of God's love for us.
And it's a call to action, isn't it? A challenge to look at our own lives, our priorities. How are we nurturing our relationship with God, with each other? Because if Jesus valued that connection with God above everything, if he was willing to be separated from the Father for us, how can we not respond with just overwhelming gratitude and love?
Beautifully said. And on that note, dear listener, we'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. If the earth shook when God and Jesus were separated, what does that tell us about the power of their unity? And what does it mean for us, for you, to be invited into that unity through faith?
It's something to really think about. Until next time, keep diving deep.